I've always been higher on Brian Kelly than most people have been. Not quite sure why that is. I've always thought he was a very good coach. I think that he's a very good developer. I think he's a very good teacher of the game. I also think that because of those things, I always assumed he'd end up at a major SEC job or an NFL job. There were always whispers within the coaching industry that ultimately Kelly had eyes on the NFL. I can't tell you that's not true. I can just tell you thus far, he hasn't gone that route. Maybe it's because he hasn't had the opportunity. Maybe it's because he has not seen the right opportunity. Or maybe it's just because people were kind of misled to begin with. Whatever the case may be, Brian Kelly's been at Notre Dame for quite a while now. One of the best aspects of working at 24/7 Sports is access to our network of team sites. And so I always take advantage of that. In fact, more often than not, if I know, if Colin and I are looking over which direction that we want to go with the show, and we know that we're going to talk about your program 12 hours ahead of time, like I did earlier today, I went ahead and got on the Oregon board, but I also got on the Notre Dame board, gave you a heads up. And in the Notre Dame case on Irish Illustrated over there with Tom Loy and the guys, I flat out told the Notre Dame folks, here's what I think about Brian Kelly. You tell me what you think. You tell me if I'm wrong. And basically my thought with Kelly, whether it be the 2012 Alabama game, but not so much that one, but more recently that Clemson game in 2015, was it, the semifinal game, where they were competitive but ended up getting beat by like 4 touchdowns. My thought was always that Kelly was going to look across the field one time and he was finally going to say, even my best here, I'm not going to be able to put together the kind of roster that they have over there. But I think I'm capable of it. There may just be limitations at my current place of employment that are not allowing me to do that. Now, that's what I put on the board there, and I got some really good feedback. But I remember vividly thinking after the Clemson game, not the Alabama. The Alabama game, they got steamrolled, and they weren't really ready to compete at that level. But I, like a lot of you, 3 years later, I think it was, when they played Clemson in the semifinal game, I really believed, or it was more than that, like 4 or 5 years. Anyway, I really believed that they were ready. And listen, I think they were much more competitive with Clemson that day. Your eyeballs bear that out. But that's the whole point. They were competitive with Clemson until near halftime. And then all of a sudden, Clemson pops them a couple times, and it's 23-3. And then you come back from halftime, and it's 30-3. And I imagine Brian Kelly kind of looking across the field, game's over. Just like that, game's over. And you think, like, we pushed them a little bit here today. We were competitive with them. And there's a 4-touchdown margin on the scoreboard. And margin's what it's all about. And I mean margin for error. Because when you have the kind of athletes stacked up that a team like Clemson does, a place like Alabama, Ohio State, same teams we just mentioned over and over again, LSU, when you have that kind of talent, what you can do is you can be totally dormant for a quarter and a half, 2.5 quarters, 3 quarters. When that 80-yard touchdown is always 1 or 2 plays away, the margin for error that you give yourself is so much wider than the tightrope that you have to walk if you do not possess that kind of talent. And Notre Dame has not possessed that kind of talent. There have been years they've been very solid defensively. There have been years they've had really good offensive lines. I'm not talking about across the board, and I'm not poo-pooing their roster entirely. We're not talking about going 8-4 here. We got a real big boy conversation about going toe-to-toe with the big boys and what it's going to take. I had someone tell me actually on the board there, hey, it's no knock on Notre Dame that they got beat soundly by Bama and Clemson. A lot of teams get beat soundly by Bama and Clemson. Well, that's true. Like, who do we want Notre Dame to be here? A lot of teams? Or do we want them to be in that rarefied air? And so the question really becomes, because based on everything that we see here, that I don't think Brian Kelly's going anywhere. And you hear him talk, and a lot of that maybe has passed, and he's a Notre Dame for life kind of guy. And so really what it circles back to is, what would it take for them to ascend into that level? And so one of the posters there on Irish Illustrated had a really, really good take that I think I pretty much agree with. Here's how it went. Here's the blueprint. I think that Clemson 6 years ago is a really good one to look at. All anyone could talk about when discussing Clemson was how they choked away big games. They called it Clemsoning. Doesn't that seem like a long time ago? But you remember that, don't you? You remember Clemsoning? You remember how that little tiger paw on the side of the helmet always meant that, don't worry, they'll blow it. That was Clemson for a long time. That narrative's been rewritten. Poster continues. Then they got a generational quarterback in Deshaun Watson that elevated them above the plateau they were on. Absolutely did. It made them competitive against elite programs. Eventually, it turned them into an elite program. I'm not saying Notre Dame can become Clemson. There's too much uniqueness there in terms of coaches staying, institutional buy-in, etc. But the blueprint, this is dead on the money. Listen to this. The blueprint of a generational quarterback leading a less talented team to playing with and beating the big boys, which allows them to then recruit better and possibly become one of the big boys, is what Notre Dame needs to find. That was very, very well put, dead on the money. That's what's got to happen at Notre Dame. Generational quarterback walks in the door. Think along with me, because that's what happened at Clemson. Deshaun Watson walks in the door. They didn't have bad talent. They didn't have Alabama talent, and they still didn't. But they had a generational talent at quarterback. And if you've got a true five-star, future first-round NFL-type quarterback currently on your roster, that's worth 10 five-star players at non-quarterback positions on any given Saturday. What they can do, the impact they can have on the scoreboard, that's worth 10 five-star kids elsewhere. And so that's what Deshaun Watson did. He competed with Alabama. The next year he beat Alabama, but all of a sudden, what was happening in the meantime, number one was other quarterbacks were paying attention, namely kids like Trevor Lawrence. But number two, elite wide receivers were paying attention, elite running backs were paying attention, and all of a sudden this stream of talent starts to trickle and then flow and then now flood into Clemson, South Carolina, like it really hadn't been before. Again, they hadn't been bad. Notre Dame hasn't been bad. We're talking about competing at the very top level of the sport. That's what will have to happen for them. Brian Kelly, either through development or recruiting, or ideally both, is going to have to convince one of the top quarterbacks in America, very, very top quarterbacks in America, to come to Notre Dame. And the other thing that has to happen is you have to be able to uniquely harness a marketing package that takes into account the academic standards being a little more rigorous there, and you turn it into a strength. Because the whole thing with a quarterback in a Brian Kelly system, he's going to have to be sharp anyway. So getting the quarterback on campus that's right to lead them and to ascend to a next level, to be generational, it's not going to be a kid that's a borderline academic casualty to begin with. You just got to convince them Notre Dame is the place to go. And then other quarterbacks see it happening. And then other talented kids see it happening. And all of a sudden you go from being a team that's got a good, solid, lunch pail type defense, good offensive lines any given year, good enough quarterback play, good enough receivers, good enough running back too. You got a generational quarterback, and then you got a couple of stud receivers, either from the transfer market or from the recruiting pipeline that have joined us. And all of a sudden now, Notre Dame can put up some crooked numbers offensively, because all of a sudden now they're a different caliber athlete offensively than they ever have been. I think the poster was right. I think that's probably the way that Notre Dame has to go. And so that was a really, really interesting kind of conversation there that's still going on, I would assume, over there at irishillustrated.com. But Notre Dame is not a place that I think, like I used to, Brian Kelly would look to get out of. I don't think he looks at the limitations there as being on par with maybe the way that I and some other people in the past and maybe now have viewed them from afar. And that's all that matters. It doesn't amount to a hill of beans what I sit here in a studio in Nashville and think about the Notre Dame program and what they can and can't do. It's what he thinks and then what he can convince other kids to think. That second part, obviously, being the optimal point.